Welcome to Dedicated. I'm your host, Doug Brunt. Today we're with Spencer Klavan. Spencer is a best-selling author and a trained classicist with a PhD from Oxford, where he's gone on to be a lecturer at Oxford. He is also the very successful host of the podcast Young Heretics. Spencer, welcome to the show.
Doug, it's great to be here. When you said I'm a trained classicist, I feel like everybody has to stand back. I don't know if there's something dangerous about that.
You're the first trained classicist I've ever met.
Are you really?
So I'm excited to find out what all that means.
Okay. Me too, actually. It'll be an adventure, a learning discovery for both of us.
Well, we'll do it with some scotch.
Excellent.
For sure.
Yes, okay.
We've got Macallan 12-year here, which, by the way, is the very drink that your dad and I had here about a year ago.
I know. I feel like I've let the side down by not coming up with something more original, but honestly, if it ain't broke,
exactly,
don't fix it. Yeah.
This is a good choice.
Excellent.
Do a couple fingers there.
Cheers. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Terrific. That is good.
That's
Never
good
gets
stuff.
old.
Very easy on the bartender, too. That's even easier than opening a beer.
Exactly. You can just, take it neat, sip it slow. It's really, as I was saying to you earlier, I have the palate of a chain smoker, so only very intense flavors make any kind of impression upon me. People talk about wine, the graphite and the faint top notes of petrol. I'm like, I don't have the taste buds for the, the minute you start like pricing wine over like $100, I start to think I don't have that many taste buds.
Right, this
that
is
many dollars worth
me.
of taste buds. Yeah, exactly. So
I'm the same. I was joking with you that I've got to save something for old age. If I start drinking scotch now, what's going to penetrate my palate later on? But maybe it is old age. Maybe I've arrived and I've got to start drinking scotch
Age
now.
ain't nothing but a number. Personally, I've been 65 since I was about 15. So, and I'm having a great time.
That's
old
funny.
men have all the fun.
Like the Michael J. Keaton, right? Yeah, Alex P. Keaton. I merged the actor and the character.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm just, they used to call me an old soul, which is a really, really nice way of saying you are a huge nerd. We're going to have to wait until after high school for you to have any friends. That's what that means.
That's funny. Well, let's stay on the theme of your dad, because with your childhood, there's so many big brains in your family. Your dad, of course, is a very successful, prolific writer and podcaster. His father, your grandfather, was a very successful radio guy here in New York City.
Right.
And then on the other side of the family, your grandfather was a university professor and a writer. Your aunt, I think, is a successful writer as well.
Yeah.
So that the holiday meals must have been... who gets to talk in a meal like that? Who's got a book coming out is probably the latest
Yeah, exactly.
topic.
No, we actually schedule a roundtable panel for the different courses, during the turkey at St. Katie. No, we'll have like interviewers over. No, I mean, I was extraordinarily lucky. I always joke when people tell me I have a voice for radio. They usually actually say I have a face for radio, and then I have to say, but also a voice, right? But no, it's the only family heirloom is we all have the same broadcast voice in my family that comes from my grandfather's side. And he was kind of a zany, like, that New York Jewish sensibility. And he had that morning radio show, and he was the funny man, and it was Klavan and Finch was the straight guy. And I didn't, really get to experience this about him because I was fairly young when I really knew him well, but apparently he would answer the phone in all these funny voices and pretend to be other people. And so I think my dad definitely picked up that side of things. And then I am apparently, again, I was pretty young when my grandfather Tom passed away. This is my mother's father, and he was the professor, but I'm told that his soul was kind of downloaded into my body because he's the real academic. And it's always been, you're right. We're all sort of literary types, but I've always been the real, bookish, head in the clouds, kind of categorize things, develop theories. I was in my room as a kid, like laying out all my books and, performing baby literary criticism on them. So, and it was an incredible environment to grow up in, just sort of house filled with books, surrounded by kind of literary friends.
That kind of reinforced, I've read where it's less that you read the book to your kid, as the kids are really young. Yeah. It's less that you read to them, more that they see you reading, and you must have seen everybody around you reading and writing, and then you see that it's possible. You can actually have a career either in radio or writing books.
Totally.
It didn't even occur to me that that's a way to make money for an actual living, until I was much older.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think I was probably the last person in my life to know that this was what I was going to end up doing, because I actually resisted it for a long time, kind of opposite to you, because there were so many people in my family doing it, and especially because I didn't just want to be like copying my dad or whatever.
Yeah.
And, he and I are very, very close. We share a lot. And I think that just that natural kind of teenage boy thing, I wanted to get away from anything that looked like just following in my dad's footsteps.
Yeah.
So I double majored in college in theater and classics, which is what I ended up studying, as you mentioned. But I thought that I was going to graduate college, come here to New York, and start auditioning to be an actor, which was a terrible plan. And like
you do have the theater voice. I mean, I think only Mike Rowe can compete. You definitely have a better voice, even than your dad, who's terrific. But
well, I got it from my
you and Mike Rowe, I think, are the top two voices who've been on the show so far.
I appreciate that. Thank you. It's we all, like I said, we all kind of have the same voice. But like, I went to theater, so I did the training, and I went to England, and did some Shakespeare for a while, where basically all they just teach you is practice breathing all the time and like vocal production and stuff. But no, I had actually a really formative experience for me was in undergrad. When I was a junior in college, I was sitting in the library and I was working on classics, which in the academic discipline, that's Greek and Latin. It's not like just classic literature. In general, it's the ancient world and the literature of ancient Greece and Rome. And I realized that I was having more fun doing the grunt work of classics than I was doing the grunt work of theater. I liked being on stage a lot, but hanging lights and all the stuff that goes into, most of theater, most of any profession is the stuff that people don't see. It's the stuff you do in your working hours. And I realized that I only liked kind of the end result of that in theater, but I actually just loved the process in literary studies. And even if nobody ever saw anything I did, I still felt like there would be joy in it for me. And that's kind of been a major, shift in my thinking about how to choose these sorts of things.
I had a question for you about your dad. You mentioned you guys are very close. Selfishly, I'm curious, as the father of two young boys, any tips for, because I've known that you and your dad are very close.
Yeah.
Since before I met him a year ago on the show. I've heard about that from my wife, and anyone who knows you knows that about you and him.
Him.
Any tips? Any tips for how to do it? Is there?
Oh boy, yeah. So there's this line in the Psalms that people quote a lot about kids being like arrows in a quiver. And people say this meaning like, because the line is, oh, the happiness of the man that has filled his quiver with these arrows. So people usually quote this just to mean like, have a lot of kids, right? We really want to build big families and all of that. But I think something my dad really understood is that if your kids are arrows in a quiver, that means they have a trajectory, right? They're not swords for you to hold in your hand. They are actually destined to leave you and go somewhere. And that was something my dad did so well. Was really always, treating me as somebody that ultimately was destined
for flight.
Yeah, exactly. And I think paradoxically, this, like if you let go, ultimately you're more likely to have a close relationship than if you hold on. And I think we got really lucky that we are not just father and son, we're actually friends. I think I have very few genuine close friends, and so I just happened to luck out that my dad is one of those people. So just luck of the draw on that.
Well, you both seem like terrific people, easy to get along with, and you have so many common interests too.
The whiskey helps.
You're both drinking the same.
We're both drinking the same scotch.
Yeah.
Although I have to say, this is my dad's whiskey. He and I have slightly different tastes.
What's your number one
whiskey? My number one whiskey, which is a incredibly divisive choice, is Lafroig. So
I haven't had that.
Okay, so this is a Speyside whiskey, which is the kind of little patch of land up to the north. There's different regions of Scotland produce different kinds of scotch.
That's what the Macallan is.
Yes, Macallan is a Speyside known for sort of this smooth, this very chocolatey, almost dried fruit kind of flavors. Now I'm being the pretentious guy, like notes of graphite, but no. So that's Speyside. Islay, which is where Lafroig comes from, is known for peat, which is burnt dirt, and you burn the dirt and you pass it through the whiskey in the distillation process, and it gives you that really smoky, salty.
So is there a
flavor.
famous brand that I would have heard of that's more that kind?
Lagavulin. So like Nick Offerman on Parks and Rec.
That's what he has.
That character, yeah, drinks Lagavulin, and Lafroig is the same one. I think on their like marketing, they describe it as like making out with a mermaid because it's so briny. So but I think of it as like drinking a campfire. Like it has that very.
All right, we'll exchange names later because I will order a bottle of that. Now that I'm old and drinking scotch, I'll have to try all these things.
Got to lean in. Yeah. # lean into the old man.
So you, I think, went to Yale undergrad, right?
Yeah.
And Yale makes a ton of news lately for being this place of, shutting down ideas and censorship and cancellation. And you're in the realm of idea exchange and things like that. How's your experience at Yale? Were you sort of salmon going upstream?
Well, I graduated Yale 2014. And you may remember that 2015 was Halloween Costume Gate. This is when Yale burst onto the scene for its intolerance. And what happened was you had Nicholas and Erica Christakis, now relatively famous names. At the time, they were, I think Nicholas was the master of one of the residential colleges. I could be getting this wrong, but you have these residential colleges that are sort of like student communities where you live and eat and hang out. And Erica Christakis sent out this email saying, "Let's be adults. You can wear whatever Halloween costume you want, and exercise good judgment. I trust you to be sensitive, but basically don't cancel people for putting on the Indian headdresses or whatever." And this caused a complete full systems meltdown to a greater extent than I think people had yet seen. And there was a famous viral video of the kids screaming at Nick Christakis in the quad over the line that really got across was like, it's not about having a conversation, it's about making a home. And I think this was kind of the beginning of peak woke, was when we first started to see in the water. So anyway, that's right after I left, and it was there in the bloodstream when I was there.
Yeah.
But it's almost hard to recall that it was nowhere near as dominant as it was. And so for me, it was really about navigating, like any college kid, you have to find the disciplines and the people that are really going to feed you. And I've been extremely lucky, both at Yale and at Oxford, that I just made my way through providence and some degree of luck to classicists and other scholars that really did and still do excellent work. I think of myself as in the Iliad, there's a hero that walks from ship to ship because he's so big, he strides across the prows. And that was kind of like me in college and grad school, except the ships were sinking behind me as I went. And
it's like Jack Sparrow walking onto the dock.
Yeah, exactly like that.
That's interesting. Do you feel like we are now off peak? So 2015 was bad.
Yeah.
I think it got worse from there through George Floyd. Are we still up in the George Floyd era, or do you think it's coming back down?
Yeah, it's so hard to tell because what happens with this stuff is it makes a big splash in the media. And then when the people who genuinely, true believers who believe in this stuff, I think they see their opportunity and they just push whole hog. And so that was 2020, I think, is George Floyd created this pretext for burning cities down and demanding maximal woke in every institution of American life. And there was only like a window of opportunity that they could do that, because that stuff just is so toxic and it's so suffocating that ultimately people get sick of it. And now I think we have backed off of that because you can't sustain that level of panic and fervor. But during that time, what they do is they basically lock it into the institutional procedures. And so you get stuff like DEI, where it's kind of baked into the requirements.
Well, once you make that a position head too, I think 20 years ago, everyone was supposed to be thinking about DEI,
right?
Whether you're the chair of the English department or the history department or whatever. And then once you have a full-time position, vice president, and they come in and all they do is think about pushing that all day long, then it's pretty embedded.
Because their salary's bound up in it, for one thing.
Yeah.
That's going to be really hard to walk back. I don't think it's impossible, but that's going to take a while.
Yeah. History, I think, is one of the last bastions or one of the the forces for good to kind of hold the line a little bit. History, comedians, lawyers, people who are sort of fact-based and have a longer view of things. They're not so reactionary.
Is that what you studied, history, or you're just looking at it?
No, I was poli-sci.
Okay,
because I think that was the easiest major. I did not take my university days very seriously, unfortunately.
No, I mean, honestly, I teach now at New College, Florida, and I tell my students that I didn't really for the first couple of years either. I had I was big into theater, and I didn't do as much of the intense linguistic work that I ended up later doing. So that you can always turn this stuff around. But
so when you're teaching, are there steps you take to foster open exchange of ideas, tell people you can say anything, wear anything on Halloween you want, whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I am not in charge of their social life, which makes it kind of easy. I'm just teaching them a survey of Greek literature, basically. And it's New College, Florida, which is the college that made the news because DeSantis and his legislature kind of intervened to undo some of this DEI stuff, and it has since become it was always, to some extent, a liberal arts college, but it's now become really a bastion of that ethos. So I don't have to wage, like a one-man war the way that somebody like Amy Wax at UPenn has to really stand her ground on that. But no, I do. I mean, there's a wonderful quote by Burckhardt, who was one of the 19th century German classicists that really helped define the discipline. And he says, you can't really give people much as a professor. There's not much you can pass on to somebody who's not willing to do this stuff out of his own heart. But what you can do is you can convey that there is joy to be had in the life of the mind. And if you can impress that upon people, then they will go away and do their own stuff. So that's really my aspiration, at least, is just the first thing I say is honestly just do the reading. Like, I don't care if you hate it, I don't care if you have woke ideas about it, conservative ideas, whatever, but like, if you don't do the reading, we can't even start. Do the reading, and then we'll have fun, and you can kind of see that. That's
what that reminds me. My wife's father used to go in for the parent-teacher conferences for her and her siblings. And he would just say one thing, that, they would show the whole curriculum, and here's what we're up to this year, and this and that. And Dr. Kelly, he was a professor, university professor, and they said, Dr. Kelly, what do you think about this? He goes, I don't care about any of that. I don't care what you're teaching my daughter or my son. Just do not disrupt their joy of learning.
Yeah. There's a lot of that, I think, a lot of disruption of people's joy. I mean, we lived in London until I was 7, and I was a precocious kid, so I was reading a ton of stuff, and I was going beyond the assignments, and I have a really visceral core memory of the teacher telling me I had to stop reading so much because I was getting ahead of the class. And I just thought, like, that's if there's a negative image of the ideal teacher, that's
when you read and when you teach the things that you're having your students read. Is that in English, or are you doing it in ancient Greek and Latin and things?
Right now, I'm teaching in translation. In English. I have taught both the language itself and the literature in the original, which is great. It's just an added layer of kind of technical competency that you have to be checking whether they know how this verb works, as well as thinking about what does it mean that Odysseus spent so much time.
Well, I'm going to have to go to my notes for this, but I know you've gone one step farther than that, because you have actually used the word built. You have built 3 languages.
Oh, yeah.
Atlantean, if I'm pronouncing it right.
Yeah.
Atlantean is one. Hill folk.
Yeah.
And Saxon?
Saxon, yeah.
Saxon. And these are all descended from Old Solar by C.S. Lewis.
Wow. You've done your research. Yes, absolutely.
So by descended from C.S. Lewis, does that mean that the etymology of the words, this word looks a little bit like that word, or is it sort of the sounds, German's more throaty and guttural and French is more in the front of the mouth? Is it that sort of thing, or?
Great question. It's more the first. It's basically the relationship that English has with, say, the Germanic languages, that there are these etymological connections. One of the things I learned from doing this, so I always say this is how I got Tolkien pilled, because I was never a big Lord of the Rings guy until Daily Wire asked me to create these languages, and they did it because everybody loves Tolkien, and they know that he created this language for, it really helps define the fantasy genre, that you have this imaginary world that includes language. And I always thought this was like way too obsessive. It's sort of like in the episode of The Simpsons where they're making fun of the Star Wars prequels, and they're sitting in the legislature, and one of the giant ice walkers from the first trilogy bursts through the door, sits down, puts on a pair of bifocals, and starts reading tax law. I always thought, why do we need these minutiae of the world? Just tell me the story. The minute I sat down to do this, I realized it's because language building is world building. These are the same. In order to make up a plausible, convincing imaginary language, you have to tell an imaginary story about where it came from, because every language has this story that's baked in. Our English language that we're speaking now, right, comes from the Anglo-Saxon, Germanic roots, but it also has French layered over it by the Norman Conquest. It's got German or rather Latin from the Church. It's got a whole history of kind of monarchic consolidation in the modern period, yada, yada, yada. And all of that goes into the words that we're able to use in this very rich soil. And so, yeah, I basically had to tell that story about Atlantean. And the story I told is that it comes ultimately from the language of the gods, which is what Old Solar is in Lewis's books, that they speak this. And everywhere except Earth, they have a common language for all the different planets. But on Earth, because we fell, we forgot how to speak this language. But I sort of decided, well, the next best thing must be Elvish. Like it must be and Lewis made a point that Elvish was related etymologically to Old Solar.
Referring to Tolkien's.
Yeah, because they were buddies, and he kind of wanted to integrate their cinematic universes, or whatever you would call it.
I read somewhere, it must have been like Guns, Germs, and Steel or something like that, but the innovation of language happened once or maybe twice in human history. Everything else is sort of derived from these original, incredible break. I mean, imagine before language existed, to invent it is just amazing.
Totally. I mean, it's in some respects, it's the invention of humanity. Like I definitely think that language using creatures might be like what we are. And yeah, there are these giant language families. The Indo-European was the one that most people know if they know one of these. And this includes like English and Greek and Latin and these classical languages, but it also includes Sanskrit, and it is Indo-European in that it kind of covers this huge geographical territory. And then there's the Semitic languages like Hebrew and Arabic, and these in turn are from a larger family that's part of, it's in North Africa, it's in the Middle East. And yeah, these ways of thinking, like, I think if you don't spend a lot of time nerding out about languages like I do, you might think like, okay, so it's just, we've got a word for dog. The French have a word for dog. You switch these words together and you get a translation. Yeah. But really, every language is like a whole way of organizing reality. So you might have different ways of thinking about time that would affect how you experience past, present, and future. It's like very, very deep.
It's really eye-opening. We take so much for granted in the way just subject, verb, predicate. It's like, well, not everybody thinks that way. Not every culture organizes their thoughts that way.
No,
but can you speak Elvish or Atlantean or Old Hill or Solar?
Well, I'm best at Atlantean because that's the one I made up, but I don't really speak any of them. I'm embarrassed to say. I'm pretty...
Could you say a sentence in any one Elvish?
Yeah. Do I have my phone with me? Can I get my phone?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Here, wait. Hang on. I'll grab my phone and find you a sentence of Atlantean, and then you have to watch. You have to watch the Pendragon series to see them. But I have them. These all kind of embarrassingly on my
Pendragon from the King Arthur stuff?
Yeah. That's the series that Daily Wire is making that includes these languages. And so they already had me record all of these for the actors, which was incredibly fun to work with them. But let me find...
You should be doing some voiceover work with your voice. I'm telling you, it's like you and...
This is, why I love reading my audiobooks, because it gets to experience that, a little bit of that old acting. You can take the kid out of the theater, but not the theater out of the kid. Okay, I've got to find you the really cool one, because there's some like great speeches in this show, and I hope that I'm not scooping whatever content.
Right, this is a Daily Wire subscriction thing.
Yeah,
so set the scene for us. There's the Knights of the Round Table.
Knights of the Round Table. But this is the if you think of the speech that Aragorn makes before the gates, where he says, there may come a time when the courage of men fails, and whatever. This is not. This is like the equivalent.
For our non-Tolkien listeners, that's Lord of the Rings.
Exactly. Sorry. Yeah. If you've seen the movies, that's where they're sort of okay. And so there's so this is where he says, "Men of Godel, remember the day of our woe. Remember what they took from us. Today we send them to meet their accursed God." So here's the translation into Atlantean. Godeoner tiem narel zelchner chliemon arbolal, tiem naren inyal ashra chliemon esekapt, chliemanyota arbolin tukar kampal eldil zeamon.
That's cool.
You asked
that
for
sounds amazing. Yeah, I'd like to see Adam Carolla pull that off.
No, actually, he was my understudy for the. I consulted with him in the construction.
That's great. Now, so did you build a dictionary? And there's a whole.
So yeah, you can go to different levels.
Book?
There's not a whole dictionary of Atlantean, which would be the next step if we wanted. I mean, I've sort of thought if the show really takes off, then we should put out like a dictionary of all the whatever. But no, that's the hardest part of language building is the lexicon. You have to like think of every word you can think of.
I mean, that's the way that Tolkien built a world, as you say, is just amazing. George R.R. Martin, too. And,
yes.
It's just phenomenal when people take on this whole universe, including language and culture. And it's so rich. It blows my mind that can all come out of one brain.
And I think for Tolkien, it was very closely related to, he was a scholar of Old English, and what he kind of wanted to do, I think, is recover some of that magic that's in like Beowulf. You know, if you've read the great poems of Old English, they all have this kind of glory hanging about them. Yeah. And I think he wanted to basically reinvest the world with that glory, which is part of it.
I want to stay on translation a bit because there's something about translation that has always intrigued me.
Okay.
Most of what I read was written originally in English. Most of the writers on the show, I think everyone has written, with the possible exception of you, everyone has written in English.
Yeah.
And so I have that direct relationship with the author. One of the few exceptions is Milan Kundera, who I've always loved his writing. He writes in French and Czech.
Yeah.
So stylistically, there's an intermediate. He wrote Unbearable Lateness of Being and a number of other great books. And stylistically, though, there's an intermediary. I'm reading someone else's prose.
Yeah.
And yet I've loved his whole body of work. There seems to be a consistency in it. So the force of his ideas, the way he builds a story is kind of the same. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that, not only with modern literature, but also in the context of ancient text, wherein there might be many intermediaries, whether it's jumping languages over the centuries or it's just monks transcribing over the centuries, putting their own personal flair on things as it gets transcribed for the 20th time so that it survives 2,000 years. You know, what are your thoughts on translation and how that affects the relationship to the reader?
Yeah, it shouldn't work, right? Like, you think that there's this huge gap that is impossible to bridge between you and Milan Kundera or Homer, or, I mean, imagine like people thousands of years ago writing in a tongue that nobody now speaks. By all accounts, that should be an impossible gap to bridge. And yet, magically, somehow, it does. And because I've had experience translating, I feel very confident that, you are getting, of course, not a perfect, one-to-one experience, just like what somebody would get from reading the book in the original. But that's not an illusion, what you're describing, that you do know this author somehow. And of course, the truth is, like, none of us has a perfect mind meld with any author that we read. And you get a lot out of reading somebody's book, but you can't, like, be perfectly 100% sure that you've understood his thoughts. And that's because language is always sort of an imperfect tool. It's like this screen that we use to throw up images of our soul onto. And it's all we have. Like, we can't, I think what we really want in using language is we want to kind of merge our souls together. There's an image of the angels in Paradise Lost that when they want to commune, they just like fuse their bodies into one. And I sort of think, like, you have a really good conversation, you get to know somebody, you actually just want to be able to, like, I want to take my thought and like put it in your brain. And none of us can do that perfectly, not even great writers writing in their native tongue. But something Aristotle says has always really stuck with me about this, which is like, we don't all use the same words, but we all have the same set of experiences in the soul. So this thing, if I could take what's going on within me when I take a sip of this whiskey and I could just somehow implant it in your brain, I think you would recognize it. Like, I have that faith that there's a shared, bedrock resource of kind of human experience that we all share. And the work of translation, just like the work of writing, is just to take that, to kind of get underneath the skin of the language and try to find new clothing for it that's going to speak to another audience.
That's interesting. So even if we're only dealing in English, there are already at least two translations happening.
Yes.
It's going from your soul into the English language, and then from the English language into my soul. So we've got two translations happening.
Right. And you're a writer, so you know, right, that like it's really easy to get into a headspace where you think, I have the perfect idea for this next chapter. I can see it all. And it's almost fully formed. It feels like it's almost fully formed in your mind. And you sit down and you realize, like, I don't even have like the right conjunctions to join these two ideas together in the first sentence. Like, it feels so crystalline. But then you do, as you say, you have to do a process of translation. And this is why one of the things I always tell people who want to write is clear writing is clear thought. Yeah. And if you think that you have a brilliant idea, but you can only express it in like academic jargon or ungrammatical sentences. Like, it's not clear enough.
Yeah. You need to think it through a little bit more.
Yeah.
By the way, did you ever read The Swerve by Stephen Greenblatt?
Okay. Yes, I think, but I've forgotten everything about it.
There's, in Germany in the pre-Renaissance era, 1300s or something like that, someone discovers On the Nature of Things by Lucretius in an old monastery, and so it basically sparks fascination with antiquity and sparks the Renaissance, basically.
Yeah, I mean, Epicurus is a particular obsession of mine because he, on the one hand, in his day, he was kind of the most hated philosopher alive. Everybody thought that whatever was true and right and good, it wasn't Epicureanism. Like, you read people just absolutely destroying him. And, if there were YouTube videos at the time, it would be like, Epicurus gets pwned with facts and logic. But like, on the other hand, his way of thinking is very, very similar to modern scientific thought. And I think, and again, so much of this Greenblatt book has gone out of my head that you'll have to correct me, but I think that a big point of this whole discovery is that actually, atoms are not such a crazy idea after all. And people start to think, well, if that's not crazy, what about the idea that, like, God is very remote and everything works like a machine, and then you start to get a lot of this same.
Well, now we're getting closer to Light of the Mind, Light of the World, which is your most recent and a terrific book.
Thanks.
So let's talk a little bit about your process, because we've touched on that a little bit. You write nonfiction.
Yeah.
You draw on ancient wisdom. It's not really a history book. It's more like applied history, I think. Lessons of ancient wisdom on the present day world in some ways. How do you pick your subjects, and how do you start the process of writing the book? Yeah,
it's funny. There's always, I think, every book generates the next book to a certain extent. So usually what I'm doing is I'm trying to answer some question for myself. And with How to Save the West, my first book, it was really like, what the heck is going on? It was very, very broad, and what had happened is I had gotten out of grad school, spent 5 years blissfully stashed away in Oxford, translating people like Epicurus, and came here to the States into a 21st century world that seemed in like dire turmoil. So suddenly, out of this peaceful, idyllic landscape, I'm like surrounded by 2020 and COVID, and like, what the heck is going on? And so in some respects, that book is just like, a classicist that studies the history of the West in the broad sense, like tries to make sense of our moment. And yeah, what I discovered in that process was that, you kind of work out your answers to that question. And there's always one point where you just think like, oh, I want to go off on this other route, but it would be a whole other book. And so then you kind of bracket that, and then you write another book. And for me, it was, as I wrestled with the problems that I thought we were facing, I realized I sort of feel like all of them come back to God. They come back to what Nietzsche called the death of God, this loss of transcendental belief in the modern world. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, like, really a major thing that's holding people back is this idea that science is the truth and religion is false. Like, that these two things are at odds with one another. You can believe one or the other. And obviously the one with evidence is science. And that's how Light of the Mind, Light of the World was born, because I love science. I am a believer. And I just really wanted to tell a totally different story about science's history and how God is alive.
I hadn't thought about the compatibility of it. And again, it's sort of a return to antiquity, where, one of the larger themes of this book is that the purpose of science can be to prove the existence of God. Which is more consistent with ancient thinking. Somewhere around the Darwin era, science was more of an undermining force. It's proving it was opposed to religion, and more advanced, I guess, scientific thinking, more recent, quantum physics can actually start to prove, wait a minute, it actually might be proving the existence of God.
Yeah, I would almost even put it a slightly different way, which is that science works out the implications of God's existence, which is, if you think about it, almost a stronger claim. So the great revolutionaries of what we now think of as the scientific revolution, guys like Isaac Newton and Johannes Kepler and even, Galileo and Copernicus, what they thought they were doing was cashing the check that God wrote when he made us. They thought that we are, because God exists and because he made the world rationally and because he made us in his image with rational minds, therefore we can expect audaciously to understand the movements of Saturn, which is kind of crazy to think. If you're a pure Darwinist and you just think we're monkeys with overheated brains, you have no reason to expect that we should be able to send a rocket to the moon. All of that stuff is way outside of anything we would ever need to deal with for our survival. Mm. And so if you believed that we're just monkeys, you wouldn't expect to be able to send a rocket to the moon. But guys like Galileo believed something totally different. They thought we are divine creatures, children of a God who made a rational universe and means to be understood. And therefore, I expect to be able to figure out, dang it, whether the earth revolves around the sun or the sun revolves around the earth. And you're right. We sort of lost that in the really 18th and 19th centuries because mathematical reasoning was so successful that it sort of looked like everything was math. It looked like we could just bracket God entirely and not think about him at all, and then we could forget that God even existed. But as you say, now with quantum physics and some of the latest discoveries, it even turns out that you can't even forget God or put him aside just for the purposes of doing science. You actually have to think about the role of humanity in the universe again, the way that guys like Galileo did.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating book. This is not the kind of book that you read for 5 minutes going to bed. This is one you gotta,
unless you want to be put to sleep, right?
But actually, that's no way to read really any book. I think I've actually stopped doing that. I used to read before I go to bed.
Yeah,
but then I wouldn't even do that to any book, really. The best is if you can carve out 3 hours, which in my career I often can, but anyone should carve out at least 1 hour to read and seriously take in a book. But for your book in particular, it's so thought-provoking. It can't be too interruptive. You can't just do this book for 5 minutes.
Well, thanks.
And nor would you want to, because you get caught into the thread of what you're saying, and it's, you got to kind of stay on the thread a bit.
I think that's a major part of my goal is, I hope it's fun to read in the sense that these are exciting stories to me. And, when you get onto Humphrey Davy, the 19th century English chemist who's just getting his bros together and inhaling laughing gas to figure out what it does, come on, it does not get better. So there's a lot of good drama in the history of science. But yeah, I think that these threads are very tightly woven together.
That was a funny thread. That no one's out there saying that maybe this is bad for us. Could we possibly be killing brain cells? No, it's really fun. I'm sure it's.
Can you imagine a modern scientific, PI, the head of a lab, being okay, what we're gonna do is we're gonna mail out laughing gas to the greatest poets of our generation and ask them to describe this is when science really is the Wild West.
Yeah.
And yeah, so but as you say, these things are very tightly woven together, right? Even just in this conversation, to understand science, you have to understand a little bit of theology. You have to know what people's motivations were. There's a lot of just political history that goes into it. Mm-hmm. And I feel very strongly, I don't know what you think about this, that we are in an age when people are hungry to understand the connections between things again. For a while, what was cool and important was to really specialize and drill down into one thing. Mm-hmm. And so you get people that have this fabulous grasp of something like chemistry, but no idea what to think about politics, or when they talk about God, they just sound dumb or whatever. Now I think we're pulling back the camera again a bit and just thinking what's the whole picture? Where does it all fit together?
I hope so. That sounds better. A more liberal arts approach to life, be a little bit more generalist in our thinking and a little more, get a little broader perspective on people and cultures. And
yeah, I think so. I always think about this op-ed that Stephen Hawking wrote in the Wall Street Journal about God, where he said, we don't need God because physics can explain the universe. And that's because you can generate universes out of nothing using just a few physical laws. And you think Stephen, that's a dumb argument. That's not even an interesting argument against God. This is theology 101. Where do the laws exist? Are they in a mind? Who wrote them? Where do they come from? There's just basic, obvious questions that present themselves. And you think for a man of that intellectual caliber, not only to be ill-equipped to navigate in a discipline besides his own, but to not even realize that there was a whole tradition he didn't understand is a symptom of like a hyper particularized age. It's like when you've really gotten so specific about each field that nobody can see.
Yeah, he's so specialized in that particular discipline. So much of his thinking is founded on it. It's almost like back to the language thing. When you think subject-verb agreement, it's hard to think, well, another mind might work another way, and you don't even think to ask the question.
Totally. I mean, that's a big, going back to wokeness, right? I think this is a major feature of wokeness, that they say that you don't need to read old books because they're racist and backwards and wrong. But what they really mean is that you shouldn't read old books because then you'll discover that they're not racist and backwards and wrong. Like, it depends, to a certain extent, it's like this self-generating thing where it depends on the prohibition or the condemnation in order to sustain the idea that condemns the past.
That's connected to something I heard you talk about on a podcast somewhere. I can't remember if it was yours or you were a guest on one, but I was doing some research on you, and you talked about art and morality and cancellation in art. And this is something Douglas Murray, he was on the show a while ago and had a book titled similar to yours. Yours is How to Save the West, your older book, and he had War on the West.
That's right. Yeah.
Both are sort of a defense of Western values in a sense, but different approaches. But he also wrote a piece on art and cancellation. He was talking about Picasso, and there's this rash of people saying, we got to cancel Picasso, no more Picasso exhibits. And he was sort of separating the art from the man and things like that. But can you talk about art, morality, and censorship in art?
Well, one of the things that's so funny about these woke movements is that they act like they discover things which are actually ancient questions in philosophy, and morality in art is a perfect example. Like, suddenly we realize that it's a little bit complex, that sometimes bad people make good art. Like, that's Plato's Ion, bro. We've been talking about this for thousands of years, and it's complicated. It's not like these issues don't exist, right? Of course, as Douglas points out, like, there is, in fact, such a thing as a bad person making great stuff, and you do have to reckon with that to some extent. Like, you don't have to have him over to your house for a drink. In fact, you might not want to, but that doesn't, and you have to engage in a kind of willful blindness to insist that therefore this man has nothing to offer us. And I think, we have gone through, before we went through the woke period, we went through a period of art for art's sake. We went through this era where it was just common knowledge that, whatever you write, if it's beautiful, it doesn't matter what moral effect it has on people. And the only people that care about the morality of art are prudish, backwards, conservative Christians, right? And this was like, the high noon of authors like Vladimir Nabokov, a wonderful writer, but who wrote this book, Lolita, famously, right, about child molestation. And he said things like, there's no moral in tow. Art only is there to produce a kind of aesthetic delight. And I sort of think that attitude was so obviously wrong that it was kind of bound to produce this backlash in the other direction. Like, these are two totally oversized and caricatured ideas. One is art has no moral effect on you, and the other is like the only way to judge art is by the morality of our present moment. And the opposite, sort of a blend of these two things is true. Art does teach us, it does contain moral truths in it, but it does so by showing us the world as it is, good, bad, and ugly, and confronting us with the complexities that happen in real life, not in academic theory. And I think that's what the wokesters really can't abide, is that.
So are you arguing that Lolita should not happen, or it should just be a small sliver of a broader, there should be Lolita and there should be something else?
Oh, I would not ban Lolita. I'm enough of a product of the 20th and 21st century that I think, these depictions of human ugliness, even by ugly people, they contribute something to our souls. They open doors into parts of the world that exist. But just as you wouldn't talk to a child about, hyper advanced like sexual concepts, just as we find that like really morally wrong, you have to think about who is going to take in what kind of art and when. And that includes yourself, right? It's part of the moral atmosphere of your world. What you're breathing in is the art that you're experiencing. And so it's not like crazy to say, well, I happen to struggle with this moral issue, and so I'm going to be really careful about the art that I consume in that domain. It's just that, if you go so far in that direction that you're like banning things across the board, I think, you've made a mistake. You're
right. There was a lot of momentum against that sort of thing. From the Nabokov era and Roman Polanski making, films and sort of behaving badly outside the films and things like that too. And there was a whole permissiveness in Hollywood around that. Fast forward to more of the woke era where somehow the dam broke and it was okay to cancel someone like that. And then it was just like a witch hunt. We're going to just get anybody.
Totally.
And there's definitely a liberal conservative bent there too. I mean, your family, I think, has lived that a little bit because your dad was having terrific success in Hollywood as a writer and a creator.
Sure.
And when he was on the show about a year ago, he was saying, he just does less in Hollywood these days because it's, he is known to be more a conservative commentator at the Daily Wire and feels like it, it's be sort of pushing a rope to kind of advance things in Hollywood. So you're very successful doing other things, but less in Hollywood than maybe, I don't know, more than a decade ago, I guess.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's kind of two issues here, right? One is, do we ever evaluate art morally? And I think the answer there is obviously yes, all the time. In fact, a major part of our reaction to a movie like Anatomy of a Fall is about, who's guilty for what and what does that mean about their character and all that. Like, we're always morally engaged when we evaluate art. But then the other question is, like, are we being fair or sophisticated in our moral judgment of art? And so with wokeness, you kind of have two problems. One is this idea that, like, we can evaluate not just the content, the sort of message, if you want to put it that way, of the art, but even just like the things that are shown. The fact that somebody does something you don't like in a movie suddenly means that you have to like kick that movie out of theaters. And then on top of that, their actual moral outlook is really twisted. So a guy like my dad, who is really just sort of describing the world as he sees it in a perfectly legitimate, I would even say majoritarian view of how most people tend to see things. You pray to God, you try to do right, not do wrong, all of this stuff. That becomes in itself kind of evil because there's like the part of the problem is that the moral outlook itself is flipped in Hollywood.
Yeah. There are two. One is just the product. They don't even like the end result.
Right.
And then that's just like, no, I can't, which is just total nonsense. And then there's the separate thing of, there's the art, which might be fine, but it's the person who produced it. Then you're looking at the sort of the behind the scenes, like, well, I don't agree with that person. And therefore all of that art must also be dismissed, whether it's a reflection of good, bad, or indifferent.
Yeah. And by the way, we have the opposite problem as well at the same time. When somebody gets up at the Oscars and says, like, it's Leo DiCaprio, and he says we need to like reach carbon zero or whatever nonsense he's on about today, everybody acts as if this is a person with something to say. Why? Because this is a guy who acts so compellingly as a charming, charismatic, intelligent individual that we've sort of given him moral credit for that. And this is what, speaking of Plato's Ion is about this, brilliant rhapsode who recites Homeric poetry so beautifully that everybody thinks he knows about war. And Socrates kind of prods him and quizzes him a little bit and realizes this guy's a total idiot. He doesn't know anything about anything. He's just a very skilled performer. And I think we've done that so much with our actors. We treat them as if they are these political oracles that, of course, when they fall short in our moral estimation, we're going to decide that they're bad actors because this script goes both ways.
Yeah. Well, I think the duping of the American people around that stuff has gotten less and less. I don't know if it's due to Instagram, where we can see more of their personal lives and their failings than we did in the 60s when we didn't know much about, what Sinatra was actually really doing. But I think, whether you're a fan of Kamala or not, I know a lot of Democrats and Republicans who are looking at campaign strategies and realizing hiring the Beyoncés and the Oprahs and the Leonardos of the world to come speak on your behalf could actually backfire, might do more harm than good.
isn't that bizarre that those celebrities have kind of become cringe? And this used to be this was like the Democrats' major PR strength. They owned celebrity, you know, and they still own a certain kind of celebrity culture, but it's institutionalized celebrity culture. And, you know, you live by the trend, you die by the trend.
I mean, now it just sort of gets a collective eye roll. Like, oh boy,
totally.
You know?
I mean,
it's actually just stomach turning to me. It's not making me want to, you know, rally and support. It's kind of bumming me out.
Well, this is another feature of the whole art and morality thing, right? Is that artists are always sort of fringe characters. They're sort of anti-establishment, on the edge of the rules of society, because it's the job of politicians to write rules that work for normies. Mm-hmm. It's the job of artists to show that there are more things on heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. There's always going to be some edge case. And this is why for a long time artists were very good liberals, because they were always coming up with the story that could explode your generally good rule for society. You say like, okay, you know, most people do well when they are, you know, monogamous for life and they build a nuclear family and they get married before they have kids and all of this stuff. And then the artist will come along totally legitimately and say, yeah, but look at this like one person that whatever was, you know, had to leave her husband and then raised a family on her own. And she was this beautiful single mom. And like, in itself, that's a perfectly legitimate and interesting world-expanding artistic vision. But then if your project is to destroy the nuclear family, you can come along and be like, look at this story about this beautiful, strong, proud, independent woman. Like, how dare you say that most people should get married before they have kids? And then suddenly you've destroyed the structure that works for 99% of people. So that was like a dynamic that was working really well for the American left, I think. And then over my lifetime, they became not just the establishment, but like the most hidebound, oligarchic, suffocating, oppressive establishment in modern history. Like, you can't find a worse mob than these wokesters. And so suddenly all of that artistic power vanished because the thing that they were presenting was the establishment. Like, it's not cool anymore.
I can tie this back to quantum physics right now.
No way.
Albert Einstein was the outsider presenting radical theories, revolutionary theories. He was the fringe. And then second half of his career, Einstein becomes the establishment. And he says no to the next guys who are actually turned out to be right. And he sort of embarrassed himself in the second half of his career.
This is what they call a segue. I bet your ad reads are great. Like, is this also about pillows somehow?
Just about more scotch. We need like one more finger of scotch here.
Well, okay, yeah. So this is, to me, endlessly fascinating. I mean, the career of Albert Einstein, such a lovable man. You know, some of these characters in history just stand out as decent people. And I use Einstein in the book a lot as an example of somebody who is obviously brilliant. I mean, his name is synonymous with genius. He's clearly well-intentioned and decent. And also, there are certain places his mind just won't go. And quantum physics is one of them, or at least the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics, that we genuinely have an effect on the world by observing it like that. He just won't accept that. And I think relatedly, he can't believe in biblical religion after he finds out basically about the dinosaurs. And I think both of these things are related to each other weirdly, because he has this picture of the world, and he says this in his book on relativity. He's the kind of one that he wrote for the general public. He says, eventually we will find a comprehensive description of reality where the numbers map onto the bedrock of existence, onto like what is in the world. And if that's your idea about the world, that it's just made up of like definite objects that can be counted up, then quantum physics is completely brain scrambling, and you're going to lack, I think, some of the, you know, sensitivity to things that can't be quantified that you have to believe in God or to experience the spiritual.
So we had the same Stephen Hawking problem of just too far down one hole to ever sort of up periscope and take a broader view again.
Yeah, and I don't think that's Einstein's problem. I don't think that's something about Einstein's character, that he was like born doomed that way. I think he grew up in a culture that valued one kind of truth only, and that was quantifiable mathematical truth. And I think obviously quantifiable truth is valuable and important. But we saw during COVID what happens if you only think in terms of statistics, and if you sort of insist on this, calculation forward view of the world. You leave people no room to say, well, okay, even if we can reduce the risk of COVID by another fraction of a percent, I still think it's worth it to me to go to my grandmother's funeral or
not mask up our kids for 3 years in a class.
Yeah, and that's not worth it is not a quantifiable statement, right? Like you can't attach a number to your ethics or your values. And so if you can't think in terms beyond what can be tallied up, then you're like, that's going to fall on deaf ears. And I think that's kind of what happened in COVID. It was just like,
this is all fascinating stuff. I'm looking forward to it. So what are you working on next? I'm ready to read the next thing by you.
Wow. All right. You guys are just
what's the next?
I feel like this one just came out.
You've got some language and some...
Tired, man. It's the holidays. I'm taking a break. Come on. No, actually, I do have another book in the making, and
the show, right? The Daily Wire show.
The Daily Wire, the Atlantean Pendragon is coming out. I'm sort of my role in that is sort of done at this point.
If they don't voice cast you, it's insane. Who can I send something to?
Jeremy,
the
you're
suggestion
listening
box? All right,
listening to this?
Jeremy Boring, let's go.
I'll just text him the clip of this conversation. No, I am. I think it sounds like you. I'm really a writer at heart, and I'm happiest in my little workshop. And so, funnily enough, you put out a book and you talk to people about it, and this wonderful experience of suddenly the world gets to see it. But you're always aching a little bit, aren't you, to get back to that like 3 hours of just like deep contemplation. So I feel a little bit like I need to go into hibernation and just like inhale.
What is the most fun phase for you? Because you're researching, then there's the phase where you're drafting and putting a few pages on the pile every day, and then there's the editing. What's your best phase, most enjoyable phase?
I really love first drafts. I just can't get enough of craftsmanship. I don't know about you, but I really write slowly. I spend many hours to produce like 500 words, and I just can't. I never get over the experience of kind of like, it's sort of like we were talking about earlier. There's this like cloud of concepts, and you're sort of crystallizing it like it's a gas that's condensing into a solid until finally you hit on exactly the right word. I just like, it's like crack cocaine to me. It's so good.
When you write a good sentence, good paragraph. A great day for me would be 1,000 words, but often it is 500, and that's grinding for 3 hours.
Totally.
9 to noon is sort of my writing time.
Yeah.
And then if I have that day, if I get 1,000 words, the rest of my day is like, I am unupsettable. I'm just 100%. Had such a good day. It's like, no matter what happens next, I'm
100%.
I'm a happy guy.
See, you get it. This is hard to explain, I think, to people who like, you see people reading and writing, and I'm sure you've had these conversations where it'll be like, this Fortune 500 CEO read 1,000 books in a week, and like, what have you done? Like, you're scrolling on your phone. And it's like, I mean, I get it. But I think you're doing it wrong. If that's your measure, is like how many pages can I get written or read? I would personally rather read like 5 books deeply in a year than a million.
And then just sometimes sitting and doing nothing but thinking for a couple hours. That's actually great. No one ever gets that time, and it's so valuable.
Totally.
Just do nothing. Don't even write, take notes, listen to a podcast. That's nice. That's value add. But sometimes just sitting and thinking and doing nothing
100%.
Is when the real work happens.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard because you do, as you have to execute a really extreme discipline on yourself. Like, because writing something you could always do at any time, and that means you basically have to do it right now or you'll never do it. And so it is, for me at least, I don't know about for you, I find it really hard to do the thing where you actually just have to stroll through an art gallery or something. It feels much too squishy for me. I want to be like, doing tasks, but I can't quite let that go.
All right, so on to the lightning round.
Oh, here we go.
With Spencer Klavan. Your favorite book as a kid?
The Phantom Tollbooth. There's you do or you don't?
Do not.
This is the book I've read most times, I think, probably of all books in my life. It begins with the line something about there's a sentence before this, but basically it says, when Milo was here, he wanted to be there, and when he was there, he wanted to be here. And I've never read a more exact description of the human condition than that. And it just gets better and better. It's a sort of weird, wonky, zany
The
adventure.
Phantom Tollbooth. Yeah. What age level is that meant for? Don't use yourself as the example.
Middle school,
okay.
I think. How old are your kids?
15, 13, and 11.
I think maybe besides the 11-year-old, they could totally all read it.
All right. The Phantom Toll Booth.
Yeah.
The book or books you're reading now?
I'm reading a book called Albion's Seed by David Hackett Fisher. It's just a classic of early American history, not really related to anything I'm working on, but fascinating, like doorstopper, 900 pages about the four different...
Pre-revolution?
Pre-revolution,
like early colonies coming over?
Yeah, and it's like 4 regions of England that created 4 distinct American region. So it's like the people from Wessex made the Puritan area of Massachusetts, but the people from Sussex, they were more in the kind of like Virginia area, and it just maps on. You see how everything that we...
That's so interesting. I've never drawn that linkage back to regions of Great Britain and the UK as to why each of our regions has its own character.
Yeah.
You can draw like Spanish back to Latin, you can kind of draw the lines of the influence.
Exactly. And he shows it down to like the accents. So he'll be like, in Sussex, they do this with their R's, and that's why the Southern accent sounds like this. And
I would love that
really
book.
Cool.
I'm reading both of your suggestions so far.
Terrific. Oh, I have one other one, but this is not really, it's called Oswald Bera, and it's an old English textbook that functions as a story. So you just read it like a book, but it's like gradually teaches you Old English, which is pretty sick.
All right. Jury's out on whether I'm going to read that one.
Albion's Seed. All right, we'll stop with Albion's Seed.
I might.
Phantom Toll Booth. Okay.
The weirdest question you've ever gotten at a book event?
So I get a lot of like fanfic questions about the ancient world. So the classic one is, were Achilles and Patroclus lovers? But I always have to explain to people like these people weren't real, right? So like there's not an answer to that question. But I get a lot of like, do you think that...
It's like would Wolverine defeat Spider-Man?
I was just going to say, you get like, would Achilles beat Odysseus in a foot race? Or like, I don't know the answer.
That's great. So how do you handle those questions? You give an answer, or do you just say, I can't?
Yeah, I usually say some very annoying thing, like I just said to you, like these people aren't real, so there's not really an else. Like when the characters walk off stage, they don't go have lives off stage. They have.
You should go for it. Like 100% Achilles, and give some like really obscure reference to a particular skill he's got. Like nothing could defeat that skill.
I know. Should have stats for all them. There's an amazing
like Dungeons and Dragons. Like his hit points to this and his strength is that.
RPG. Yeah, there's a great infographic of deaths in the Iliad that somebody drew, and it's like most underrated warrior. Or whatever. I should start doing that. You're right.
Yeah. All right. Now, this is going to be a tough one. I know you're fans of both. C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien?
It's definitely Lewis for me, like 100% unambiguously, even though you're right, it's really hard. And I almost would have said Lewis for nonfiction and Tolkien for fiction, except that although I don't really like the Narnia books, I'm afraid to say, the space trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, Paralandra, and That Hideous Strength, so good. Lewis fiction. So yeah, I just, I'm a Lewis guy.
I read Narnia. I haven't read anything else by him. And so you're saying that's not even the best stuff. I gotta look elsewhere.
Yeah, you gotta watch. You have to read, you can just read That Hideous Strength. It's the third one, but it's like detachable from the series. This is definitely, forget the Old English book. Read That Hideous Strength by Lewis. It's like, did you ever read The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis?
No.
So that's like 3 short speeches where he just describes exactly the modern condition. Like it could have been written yesterday about like science and people overdoing their belief in science and whatever. And then he dramatized it into this incredible, he called it a fairy tale for grown-ups, I think. And just like this,
it's the one thing I read by C.S. Lewis that was not Narnia was an article or something he wrote in defense of the royalty. Because I've always thought, the British crown, this is so absurd. Why do they even have it? And then he wrote this, I read this piece that he wrote a long time ago, obviously, in defense of it. And it made some sense to me. I'm like, oh, well, you know what? I can see, he got into, it's sort of above politics. It's this useful thing to have, in sort of a nonpartisan promoting way. He had all these arguments that I found actually compelling. Yeah. The first time I read something compelling in defense of, monarchy's kind of fun and frivolous, and it's fluff in a good way. Sure.
We all
although it's expensive fluff for the British, but anyway, he wrote a good piece on that.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, this is why. So Lewis is my number one intellectual hero. He is the guy I would most aspire to be like, and it's because he embodies that principle of clear writing is clear thought. And he was not respected as much as I think he could have been in his day had he done a little bit more fireworks, had he sort of made himself out to be this incredibly difficult and dense academic writer. But you read a book like Miracles by Lewis, and every page of that is like the tip of an iceberg, and underneath are volumes of Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle. And if you've read Aquinas and Aristotle, you sort of see him making these arguments, but he never mentions it. He wears it so lightly. It's just like this breezy. So I just always find him persuasive because he's so clear.
But what is it with all the initials in this genre? There's C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, George.R.R. Martin, J.K. Rowling.
Good question. I have
If you go S.A. Klavan.
I could go S.A. Klavan.
This could all go next level.
The A, I always insist on the A because it's my middle name is my dad's name.
Nice.
But S.A. Klavan would be pretty fun. I don't know. Maybe that's what I need. That's going to take me to the galaxy brain level.
All right, next question. If you could make one ancient text required reading for world leaders, what would it be?
Okay, I have an answer, but then I want to cheat and give my real answer.
Okay.
So my answer for genuinely ancient text would be Aristotle's Politics, because I think that is the best handbook of how to do actual politics. So like ancient political theory, there's a lot of great stuff. There's obviously Plato's Republic, but then you'd have to spend time like sitting pondering, did he really mean that we should live this way, or just that we should imagine this ideal utopia? And I just don't think like Donald Trump is really going to sit down and do that. Maybe I'm selling him short, but Aristotle's Politics is about prudence. It's about like, okay, you have the theory. How do you put it in practice in the world where it's never going to be perfect? And I think that is so lacking now, is you have all these people, including like, for instance, the Never Trumpers, like or the Never Kamalas on the left, right? It's like they have this perfect vision of how the world could be, so they can't just make a choice. And I really love.
Was that a thing? Never Kamalas? Were there leftists?
Yes, there were, because of Gaza.
Because of Gaza.
Yeah.
Okay.
There were there was a significant number of people that stayed home.
So just sat out the election. Like they're committed left, but they just couldn't do it.
And if you listen, one of my guilty pleasures is to eavesdrop on leftist podcasts. I love leftist podcasts. I love Pod Save America. I love the Slate Political Gabfest. And they've been particularly interesting lately because every time you lose a political election.
All the head scratching of how did that happen?
Totally. But that's actually sometimes can be the most productive, genuine conversations, is when you finally, I'm sure this is true for us, for like right-wing podcasters, that, after the Trump loss, there was a lot of really interesting, tumultuous stuff about the 2020 election and blah, blah, blah. And similarly, now you're listening to people like on Slate talk about, for the first time ever, like maybe it was bad that we left the border open for 4 years. Like maybe even if you believe in racial justice or whatever, maybe you still shouldn't just dissolve the country into soup. And so, like, yeah, I've been very interested in that. And so there's been a lot of like recrimination with they weren't called Never Kamalas, but the people that kind of washed their hands of Kamala. Kamala was insufficiently anti-Israel, which is mind-blowing to me. I mean, it's like boggles the mind to think that would be your problem with the modern American left, is like they don't hate Jews enough. But like, but that does exist. I'm sorry to say.
I didn't encounter that as much, but I don't listen to a lot of. I listen to a very small sort of subset of news. I actually I get news off X, but I follow everything. Reuters and left and right.
Yeah.
And that helps you sort of triangulate in on things. But I hadn't encountered the Never Kamala thing somehow.
You have a podcast. Are you a podcast listener?
I am. I do a lot of history podcast. Dan Carlin. You ever listen to that guy? I love the Dan Carlin stuff. Yeah. And I listen to some news podcasts too.
Dan Carlin's amazing. And he's like, I think he has politics, but he doesn't really assert them too much.
It's not part of the thing, which is nice. Which is this show, this is about as close as we veer into politics. Sure. What you and I are saying here, it's really about authors and writing and the writing process and things like that.
Yeah. And I don't think, I guess How to Save the West is a little political. Light of the Mind isn't really all that political a book. This is like, I have spent a lot of time, I work for the Claremont Institute. I have, a sort of definite political position, as I'm sure has become clear, but I'm really not that interested in politics either, except as like an outgrowth of ideas. It's become entertainment. I have to say, I think that's why more young people are into it. It's somehow, and maybe this is a Trump effect, because he is at heart an entertainer more than anything, really. Politics has become sort of an entertainment, almost blood sport in some ways, when it really gets down to election season. Plato in the Laws, which most people think was his last dialogue, says you don't have a democracy, you have a theatrocracy, ruled by spectator.
Man, that guy could see around corners.
He knew a thing or two.
Yeah.
But can I give you my cheat answer to this question?
Yes.
It's not ancient, but Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. Speaking of guys that saw the future coming, tomorrow's news today, this guy's watching the revolution in France. The one man living who condemned the French Revolution, but accepted the American Revolution because he saw the difference between the two of them. And that book is the most blistering indictment of central planning I think I've ever read or will read. And I think it would be a terrific antidote to a lot of what goes on in modern politics.
Wow. All right.
Yeah.
All right. After this, I'm writing down all these books. I've got at least 4 that I need to read immediately.
Oh yeah. If you haven't read Reflections, definitely do yourself a favor. Great.
All right. Last question for Spencer Andrew Klavan. One piece of advice for the audience.
Everything is a trade-off. Absolutely everything is a trade-off. Thomas Sowell, blessed be he, says this about economics. And of course, it's true in economics that I give you money, you give me a hat, whatever. That means that I want the money more than the hat and you want or rather, I want the hat more than money, you want the money more than the hat. And that's how, the market increases value even as each of us loses something and gains something else. So it's not that everything is a zero-sum trade-off, but everything is a trade-off of some kind. If you take that idea and you apply it to everything in your life, you will think 10 times more clearly about any decision you have to make. 3 hours of reading a day, for example, right? That's 3 hours that you are not spending on Netflix. And when people come to me and they say, like, how do I read the classics or whatever, I say, like, you want me to give you a list of books that you can go away and read, and then you can check that off the box and you never have to think about reading again. It's like a homework assignment because you don't want to trade anything in. You want to take a moment and do this and then go back to your regular life. But if you actually want the life of the mind, you have to spend an hour a day, and that's going to be an hour that you don't spend doing other things. Now, I bet you do, not you personally, but this imaginary, people out there do at least 10 things a day that would be better traded for an hour of reading. But it is going to be a trade-off. And until you realize that you're trading something in for everything of value that you get, you're likely to make bad decisions because you're going to think, oh, I'm losing this or that. Like I'm losing all these girls I could sleep with by marrying one woman. Yes, of course, but you're getting a lifetime of fidelity and family. Good trade-off, right? I mean, this is just everything, I feel.
That's great. I love that. That's a great framework to approach life.
I think, yeah, it hasn't failed me yet.
Spencer, what a pleasure.
It's been a
so
delight.
much.
Thank you
Great
for having me.
you.
Yeah, cheers.